Hey guys, Mr. Pokke here, back with another video. On this week's episode of CN Unit Analysis, we'll be exploring Pela. Now, Pela has been with us since version 1.0 as the only AoE defense down debuffer, and with the arrival of Jingliu, she has seen a massive resurgence of play rate amongst the player base. She's extremely simple to use, cheap to build, and universal in usage. As such, her standing amongst the supports is no doubt extremely high, even compared to the likes of 5-star supports such as Bronya and Silverwolf. This guide will seek to equip players with the knowledge to make full use of Pela's kit and crafting her ideal team compositions. Without further ado, let's get into today's content. Regarding Pela's helpful tips, the first of all being Pela's value as a unit. It increases with a player's account development or unit development. Keep in mind, Pela has not been changed, right? Since version 1.0 all the way to currently version 1.4, her kit is essentially the same. Maybe the only changes we received was version 1.2, but before tutorial mission begins Lightcone. But the reason why she was more or less underutilized at the start of the game by most players was due to our weaker relic and unit investments. So during this stage, especially at 1.0 when we just started the game, unless a player is a whale, most players will place a higher emphasis on buffers rather than debuffers to compensate for their unit's poor stats, right? So for example, back in version 1.0, when you guys are trying to build DPS, you probably have very poor damage percentage, very poor attack, very poor crit ratios, right? So in this regard, buffers such as Tingyun, Bronya, Asta, or even Yukong, their buffs matter a lot more since our baseline stats is really low, right? But now that in version 1.4, players are getting better and better relic investments, trace investments, the debuffers value such as from people like Pela, they will inevitably increase because now the value of buffs, they are relatively lower as compared to debuffs, right? We can build as much gear as we want, we can build as much crit ratio as we want, but if we can't get a defense reduction, then we just can't get a defense reduction. So that is just something to talk about Pela's value. Moving on to the next point, which is kind of linked, is that Pela is extremely cheap to raise. Essentially like an Asta, she really only needs her talent, ultimate, as well as, I guess if you want to call it, her A2 trace, which increases her effect hit rate, right? All other things in Pela's kit, they are irrelevant, especially for new players, unless you guys want to build a DPS Pela. So coupled with the reliance on only main stats, right? As long as you get your energy regeneration rope, as long as you get your EHR chest, as long as you get your speed boots, then Pela is pretty much good to go. She's really easy, excellent to use, and you guys are going to be using this Pela for a very long time. All the improvements on the substats is essentially just going to make her faster, make her more durable, but for the most part, her kit is already there, right? It's fixed. Next, Pela's skill, it cannot dispel all buffs, but it is very useful when we can make use of it, right? So Pela's skill is able to remove an enemy buff. I think at this point most of us already know this, including its stacks actually. So if, for example, if an enemy have like 3 stacks, for example, Monkey's increasing damage percentage buff, Pela's skill actually removes everything at one shot. So notable buffs, as you guys can see here, is going to be the Ape as well as the Mara stricken mobs, right? The guy that can revive back. However, this is not universal because some buffs, they cannot be removed. In particular, I'm referring to some of the buffs in like Simulated Universe, in Storm Disaster. Is basically permanently there and it's not going to be able to remove. So players do need to view the party tooltip in combat in order to know which ones can or cannot be dispelled by Pela's skill. Right, next, timing Pela's ultimate to ensure the highest debuff uptime. Now, players should be careful about the duration which is going to be expiring from the defense reduction in Pela's ultimate. For the most part, players should time the ultimate before the enemy's next turn at the top of the action value cycle, right? So what I mean by this is, if the enemy is going to go immediately after Pela's turn, in which case your attackers, your DPS, they are unable to get a turn during that period of time, then you essentially wasted 1 turn of defense reduction, right? Because the enemy would have already went. So ideally, my DPS, I want them to be there before the enemy is able to move so that my DPS can benefit from the defense reduction and do more damage, which indirectly contributes to a higher debuff uptime, right? So like I mentioned, if Pela applies the defense down right before the enemy moves, then that is 1 turn wasted since none of my units can hit the target during this debuffed state, unless we we're going to be using our unit's ultimate, which for the most part is still not ideal, right? We really want to just lump everything together and just make use of this window of opportunity as much as possible. Now keep in mind, frozen enemies have the 50% action value advance, so breaking with Pela's ultimate, it indirectly reduces the defense reduction uptime. Right, so this is just something to keep in mind. It is not technically a good thing if we break with Pela's element, which is ice, right? Ideally, we want to break with other elements so that our defense reduction uptime is still 2 turns instead of 1.5 turns. So something to note, right? And lastly, Pela has more built-in effect hit rate than other debuffers, right? Because we can benefit from our own A2 trace, which gives us, or rather the entire team, a 10% EHR. Combined with our 10% EHR from our minor traces, Pela really only needs 46.67% EHR compared to the typical 66.67% to guarantee a debuff on an enemy with around 40% effect rest. Here we come to a very interesting thing. A plus 15 EHR percentage body gives us 43.20% EHR. And from this, Pela is missing only 3.47% from 46.67, and a single EHR substat from a 5-star relic is 3.46. So I'm not sure if this is perfect game balancing, but essentially Pela really just needs a single line of EHR to reach her theoretical maximum capacity to always land her defense down, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Of course, if players do have a lot of EHR percentage from the subsets, or if we're going to be using before tutorial mission begins, which gives us another 40% EHR, then we can opt for HP or defense percentage main stat for our chest instead, or even go for crit rate if we want to go for more damage. But I'm going to be talking about this a little bit more in the relic section. Okay, moving on to Pela's trace priority, her talent/ultimate would take the highest precedence over her skill, over her basic attack. Some important threshold to keep in mind. Pela's talent at level 7 with ER rope and the before tutorial Lightcone S5, she can cast her ultimate every 2 turns, which is 2 basic attacks, essentially having permanent uptime, and you can achieve this only with a level 7 talent. So that's the important benchmark to keep in mind. Note that this 2 turns, this permanent uptime, this is assuming that our Pelas is at the same speed, if not faster than the enemy. Some MOC enemies, such as Decaying Shadow, they have really high speed, so even though you think it's a permanent uptime of every 2 turns, right? Since she auto every 2 turns, it might not always be 100% debuff uptime because, you know, they're just really fast, right? So Pela's ultimate is going to be the next thing we're going to level, since this is the one that increases our defense reduction percentage amount. And I'll be talking about this a little bit more in a special mechanic, but the more we stack defense down, the more benefits we're going to get out of defense down itself, right? So we just want to increase this defense down reduction to as much as possible. Then moving on to skill and basic attacks. Skill is just purely for damage, and it's not really that important unless we are going to be going for the DPS Pela route, or if you just want to do a little bit more damage. And keep in mind, Pela, more or less, she doesn't really use a skill that often, right? Nowadays, you really just use her basic attack, become a very good skill point generator so that she can provide us with skill points while casting her ultimate. On some rare occasions, we might use a skill, right, to remove a buff, or just casting our ice rest down, especially with an E4 Pela, but that's why I said skills, its significance is really low, and basic attack is basically just adding a little bit more damage, right? So these are her trace priorities. Moving on to her major trace, Secret Strategy, which is her A2 over Bash over Wipeout. Now, Pela's A2 trace is really the only one that benefits her as a support, right? Not only for her to apply her own debuffs with high accuracy, which is a 10% EHR, but also for our entire team, since this is a team-wide 10% EHR increase, right? So DOT comms, Kafka, right, or even Silverwolf, they are going to benefit from Secret Strategy. Bash and Wipe is not as important because it does have very little value unless our Pela is going to be used as a DPS, or you just want to deal a little bit more damage as Pela. In this case, then Bash will have a little bit more uptime since Wipeout is only tied to Pela's skill usage. Now, moving on to Pela's special mechanic, defense reduction. I have previously covered this point on my defense reduction in Pokke's Academy video very long ago. I've covered this in Silverwolf and even Jing Liu's unit analysis, but since Pela is more or less the face of defense now, then I'll dedicate this section to her as well, summarizing the key findings below. And I'm sure at this point, I think most of us have already seen this graph previously, right? Essentially how much damage increase we get from stacking on our defense, right? I've shown this in Jing Liu's previous CN Hype Watch, I believe. And to further validate this data, these are the CM Bros math as well for the defense reduction, and you guys can see it's perfectly the same, right? So 20.81, 100%. These are the benchmarks for how much more damage defense reduction brings to the damage formula, right? You guys can experiment this yourself, right? By just essentially plugging this defense multiplier formula, and that's basically how much damage you do. But it boils down to this: defense reduction stacking is the only factor within the DPS formula right now that has exponential increase in damage output the more we stack on defense reduction. The same could also be applied for res reduction as well as damage taken increase, but none of them are as widely available compared to defense down at the current moment. Hence, that we don't really have a good application where we can stack on res down, like 100% res down or 100% damage taken increase. So it's not as useful. Defense down is really the only one that we can consistently always stack it to 100% if we want it, right? So in summary, the lesser the defense reduction, the lesser its benefits, and vice versa. The more the defense reduction, the more its benefits, right? And as we know, Pela's ultimate goes up to 42% defense reduction at level 10 trace for her ultimate, 40% at level 10, right? Equipping Pela with a resolution Lightcone at S5 will translate into a 58% defense reduction by itself, which is close to a 45% damage increase, right? So as you can see here, 58 to 60 is almost a 45% damage increase, really high. And this value is extremely beneficial after factoring main DPS getting buffs from harmony supports, because as we know, stacking on our attack percentage buffs, damage percentage buffs, it will not provide exponential returns as compared to the likes of like defense reduction. Furthermore, Pela's defense reduction, it applies to all enemies, which is every single one of them, right? It's not 3 targets that destroy, it's straight up every single one of them. And considering that debuffs are also not tied to a unit's turn and is tied to an enemy's turn, Pela's standing as a skill point positive mass defense reduction debuffer makes her an excellent unit to raise. Now moving on to Pela's Eidolon Benefits, her E1, it actually has a little bit more value than players give credit for, because at a level 12 talent, right, so this is assuming that you have her Eidolons unlocked, but eventually at level 12, you do get 11 energy per hit, and combining this with ER Rope, Pela can out every 2 turns, even without the tutorial Lightcone, more easily. How this will work is having 2 basic attacks, plus Pela getting hit once, and our E1 triggering a single time. This will give us 111.04 energy, which is perfectly allows us to count every 2 turns. And also, this effect is really obvious, especially in the first waves of Memory of Chaos in the current moment, because right now for our very first wave, we are against multiple mobs, right? Because usually in the first wave, it's just a lot of mobs. We don't really face that many elites. And in the very first wave, if we were to use Pela's technique to enter the battle and then we use our skill, we can instantly cast our ultimate immediately. After we cast our ultimate, we just need to wait for the mobs to die. Pela doesn't even need to kill the mobs herself. Right? As long as the mobs die, she's guaranteed to get back this 5 energy. It's guaranteed. Alright, so pretty much we should be able to trigger our ultimate every 2 turns and then going into the next Memory of Chaos wave, right? So that's why her E1 is actually really decent, right? E2 is rather niche. We lack enemies that heavily requires buff removal, and Pela nowadays, we usually just stick to using her basic attacks unless we just run out of energy and we just missing a slight bit of energy to cast our ultimate in due time. Then we actually use a skill or just want to do a little bit more damage. But for the most part, Pela's E2 is pretty niche. Now, Pela's E4, this is essentially her game-changing Eidolon, but even for her E4, it's not, say, like super important, because as you guys can see for the effect, there's a 100% chance to reduce the target's ice rest by 12% for 2 turns. Now, rest down is very valuable debuff, right? Because as we know right now, stacking on these kind of like debuffs, as the more they stack, the more it benefits us. And these kind of things that are like different from damage percentage and attack percentage buffs, it's just really good as a damage amplifier. And this will pair really well with any ice DPS we have, namely Yanqing, Herta, and now with the recently released Jing Liu. That being said, this is only Ice rares down. This is not all rares down like Silver Wolf, right? So because of this, it is completely useless if we're going to be pairing Pela with alternative DPS that is not Ice. So even for E4, it's really good with Ice DPS, but if we're not going to be using her with Ice DPS, then the usage is definitely lesser. Then finally, Pela's E6, basically it's just an additional damage, right? The E6 works exactly like how Natasha's E6 works, right? It has its own multipliers and it can crit. Useful for some additional damage, even more so if players want to build DPS Pela, but if players don't want to build DPS Pela, then honestly her E6 is just not that great, right? So in summary, Pela is perfectly viable at E0. E1 improves a player's comfort when not using Tutorial Lightcone in favor for more damage, such as using Resolution and Incessant Rain, while finally E4 increases the Ice DPS damage output. But for the most part, E0 is just perfectly viable, which is why I say Pela is just such a easy to race unit. Now moving on to Pela's energy thresholds. Essentially it's very easy. It boils down into, do you have her using the Tutorial Lightcone or do you have her not using the Tutorial Lightcone, right? So this is basically the most part. As you guys can see over here, for E0 with any Lightcone, E1 with any Lightcone, and we got some of the Tutorial Lightcone over here. These are basically some of the thresholds. For the most part, Pela should be able to out every 2 turns, either by equipping a Tutorial Lightcone or getting her Eidolon 1 equipping with any other Lightcone. Note that this Eidolon 1 is not even a must, but it just makes life a lot easier for us, right? So for example, my current Pela right now, she's always running the Resolution Lightcone. I have not touched Tutorial Lightcone for a very long time because I still find myself in situations where I can keep up my ultimate almost every 2 turns for the most part because of this Eidolon 1. So you guys can take a look at this table yourself, right? You don't really need one whack and then just mess around with the multipliers a little bit. In summary, for new players with the Tutorial Lightcone given from the version 1.2 event along with Silver Wolf, this will be a very highly recommended Lightcone to use with the new players, right? Because now you do not have to rely on RNG, you do not have to rely on Eidolons, you do not have to rely on anything else, and you can pretty much always cast your ultimate every 2 turns, right? So really easy. We don't even need to invest much in our tracers. We just need, like I said, level 7 tracers for our talent, and we pretty much have a permanent ultimate uptime. Towards the end of the spectrum, which is if you have already played this game for a very long time and you just want to do more damage, right? More advanced players can drop the Tutorial Lightcone for Resolution or even Silver Wolf's S1 Incessant Rain to further increase the debuff amount and the damage output for DPS while maintaining 2-turn ultimate. But for this one, I highly recommend to only try this if you already have your Eidolon 1 unlocked, or if you just want to gamble a little bit on getting hit, then you can go for this. But for the most part, I would recommend the new players to use the Tutorial Lightcone, right? And as you guys can see over here, do not run Void. Pela does not need to use Void to achieve any specific energy thresholds, right? Now moving on to the relic set for Pela, Guard and Hackerspace, they are basically the all-purpose support relic, right? Damage reduction and speed, they are perfectly viable options for any support in the game. We don't want them to die, while we still want them to be fast enough to provide us with skill points, to provide us with higher ultimate uptime. So this really depends on what players need. For the new players, you should focus a little bit more on durability, hence Guard will be a pretty good piece to have, while later players, right, more advanced players, they can aim for higher speed thresholds, right, beyond the 134, you can aim for 147 or even 161. So in these situations, Hackerspace will help you achieve these a little bit more easily. Both domains, they are really good on stamina efficiency, right? Because Hackerspace dungeon, really good for all supports, all sustain, and Guard dungeon is just a super universal dungeon because Quantum set can be used by any DPS in the game at the moment, right? Another alternative is actually a 4-piece Ego set. Now, because of Pela's extremely fast ultimate, she's one of the few units in Honkai Star Rail who can make use of Ego's action value advance after using her ultimate. Strictly speaking, 4-piece Ego is actually Pela's best in slot because Pela can cast her ultimate every 2 turns. But the catch is this domain in particular is not very stamina efficient to farm because for the most part, the Ice set is really niche only for Ice DPS, and the Ego set is really niche for units that can only out every 2 turns. And currently, the units can consistently out every 2 turns is only going to be Pela and to a certain extent Silver Wolf, right? So in terms of stamina value, Hackerspace and Guard domains offer a little bit more for the new players. And then 4-piece Hunter is essentially for DPS Pela. It is viable, but it is definitely not recommended for new players because now you need to worry about crit ratio, you worry about crit damage, crit rate, all these kind of subsets. It's very high investment in terms of relics, and not only for relics as well, but also for your tracers, right? Because now you need to focus on leveling your Ice damage boost, your multipliers for skill, and all this kind of stuff. So it's just something that is not really recommended, right? New players should focus their relics and investments and all resources onto the main DPS first, right? So that they will deal the highest amount of damage. Then Pelas, right? Support side Pelas, you can just let them be a debuffer. Then towards the end game, when you really just have nothing better to farm, then you could consider transition to a DPS Pela, right? And keep in mind, the 4-piece hunters, 25% crit damage for 2 turns is in very nicely fits Pela, because we should be able to cast our ultimate every 2 turns anyway. So essentially, we more or less have like a permanent 25% crit damage for the most part. So there's Pela's 4-piece set. Then moving on to Pela's planetary set, it's gonna be Fleers or Q. This is always gonna be the best in slot, no questions asked, right? So it depends on the situation. If you wanna use a normal crit ratio DPS, then Q is gonna be more ideal. While on the other hand, Fleetless will be better for DOT DPS. Then note their respective requirements, right? Q needs 30% effect rest and Fleetless needs 120 speed. Now in that Total, I'm just gonna leave it here because if you guys really want to build DPS Pela, right? You want to see really high damage numbers on the ultimate, you could consider running a Total on DPS Pela. But even if you guys are going to be consider building DPS Pela, players should still prioritize on Q or Fleetless so as to support the main DPS. The very niche situation where you want to run Pela as the only DPS, right? Pela is your main DPS. So in this kind of situations, then Soto would be the ideal choice. But for the most part, if you want Pela to just deal more damage as a support, she's still a support, she's still a sub DPS, all this kind of stuff, then Fleetless or Q should still be a priority so that she can buff our main DPS. Then moving on to the main and sub sets, it's really easy, right? She's super easy to build. As long as Pela has the right main sets, then she should be functionable. Improve her speed, improve her rest to increase our players' experience during MOC, right? To make her go a little bit faster and resist some of the debuffs, which can be quite annoying. But even without the sub stats, right, it is really not a deal breaker. So moving on to the chest, it's going to be EHR/HP/crit rate, right? Boo is going to be speed, rope is going to be energy generation, and then sphere is going to be HP, defense, or ice damage, right? Then sub stats, going for speed, rest, and then following by HP and defense, and low is going to be crit damage. So something to note, crit ratio, right, your crit chest as well as your crit subsets is only for a DPS. If you guys are going to be building a debuffer Pela with no damage, then you can just honestly just ignore them. And another thing to note here is I didn't recommend any EHR subs because I am assuming that you are going to be using the tutorial Lightcone or you're going to be running the EHR chest, right? If you do not have these two equipped and you want to go for a HP percentage chest or defense percentage chest or even a crit ratio chest, then you should aim for roughly 44 or at least 40% EHR from subsets alone. So something to keep in mind. Now moving on to Pela's Lightcone Recommendation. This is going to be the chart created by the CM bro. This was way back since like the June, like it was almost at the beginning of the game, so it might get a little bit outdated, but for the most part this should still be relevant. Note that this chart over here specifically, this is going to be the team-wide DPS benefit based on Pela's Lightcone, but some assumptions that the CN community used for this graph is not practical, such as there's a lack of external defense reduction sources. So this will heavily reduce resolution Lightcone's value because like I said, the more defense reduction stacks, the more value it's gonna get. Also, it assumes that all other Lightcones in this scenario over here, Pela can only cast her ultimate every 3 turns, which we know from our previous Eidolons as well as energy threshold section. This is simply not true, especially in practical situations when you have Eidolon 1, when you start getting hit, all this kind of stuff. You can indeed cast your ultimates every 2 turns, very consistently rather, especially if you have Eidolon 1. So every single one of these Lightcone here, it assumes that Pela casts ultimate every 3 turns, and only tutorial Lightcone here casts ultimates every 2 turns. That's why it seems like tutorial Lightcone is really high, but that's just something I want to get across to you guys, right? So for the most part, S5 resolution Lightcone is really good on Pela because we want to stack on defense reduction as much as possible. Now, S5 resolution, it is a lot better than S1, not only in terms of the defense reduction stacking, but also the base probability of applying the debuff, right? At S1, the chance of even applying the debuff is only a 60% base chance, which means you need close to 100% EHR to land this 100% of the time, which is going to be not very comfortable for players to use, right? So the resolution's value, it will greatly increase with the superimpositions as well as more defense reduction sources such as the Genius 4-piece, Jingliu's Lightcone, or even the enemy Goldfish explosions, right? So in these kind of situations, then S5 resolution should be Pela's best in slot. Alternatively, the S5 before tutorial mission begin, this is going to be Pela's most universal and all-round well-rounded Lightcone, right? It does have less damage percent increase if we're in a situation where we can stack on a lot of defense reduction, right? or in a situation where we can still maintain our 2-turn ultimate when using other Lightcones. But without these situations, then S5 before tutorial mission begin is really just a super universal Lightcone, and I would highly recommend new players to just run this instead and just don't worry about any other things. Don't worry about dupes, right? Because at the end of the day, this is also a gacha Lightcone. Furthermore, running this Lightcone also allows our Pela to be a little bit more tankier by running our HP chest or even a crit rate chest, since this Lightcone gives us 40% EHR, which Pela also needs, right? So that's something to consider. S1 Incessant Rain. Now, 12% increased damage taken from the Aether Code is very valuable. The crit rate from this is not so much unless we're going to be using DPS Pela. But in a vacuum, this will outperform S5 Resolution, as you guys can see over here, by only 2%. Keep in mind, like I said at the start, this is only in a vacuum where there are no other defense reduction sources that we can benefit from other factors, right? So that's why it's only 2%. So the value of S5 resolution actually goes up by a lot higher if we start to approach 100% defense reduction. So that when that happens, then S1 instant rate is not going to be as good. In summary, very marginal differences across the board, or within 5% deviation from the benchmark. S5 Tutorial Lightcone is perfect for beginners to use with their new Pela, while S5 Resolution and S1 Incessant Rain can be considered to further increase Pela's debuff capabilities with proper skill cycles. And finally, we have come to our last component, which is the team compositions. Now, being extremely skill point positive, as well as being an excellent AoE defense reduction debuffer, Pela can quite literally fit in any team compositions. She has no skill point restrictions like Bronya, she has no speed tuning requirements like Eidolon, and there's absolutely no oversaturation of attack percentage or damage percentage buffs like harmony units. So, quite literally, Pela is extremely universal in the sense where every single team comp can benefit from Pela's defense reduction. For some of the sample teams over here, we do have the 3 Ice plus 0 Wolf for Ice coverage, right? So we can just use this against any team as long as they have Ice or Quantum weakness, right? Jingliu in this case, it can be Herta, it can be Yanqing, right? It doesn't really matter. So this is going to be like a mono Ice team. Then another one is going to be the 3+1 Hyper Carry for basically any DPS. Any DPS here, it can work. It can be Sile, it can be Jingyuan, it can be Himiko, it can be it can be anyone, honestly. So, but this is only for developed teams that can clear a content without taking too much damage, right? If you are going to be getting hit because your DPS is just not dealing enough damage, or if your supports are just not fast enough, then I would not recommend this 3+1 Hyper Carry. And lastly, for the DOT team comp, this is also doable, especially if players didn't raise up their Asta. You could run Pela instead, because DOTs even break damage, right? Break damage from DOT from break damage. They all get increased from defense reduction from Pela. So DOT is also perfectly viable. And with that, we've come to the end of Pela's CN unit analysis. If you guys were to engage in further discussions, feel free to check out my Discord, Pokke's Village, where we have a very active community talking about Honkai Star Rail on a daily basis. If you guys want to check out my stream, that's going to be twitch.tv/MrPokke. I'm streaming roughly 3 times a week, and the schedule will be updated on Discord as well. Let me know in the comments what kind of other CN unit analysis would you like to see. I'm working my very best to try and get as many out as to you guys, hopefully covering every single unit in Honkai Star Rail eventually in the near future, right? So that's all for today's content, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.